Good morning, everybody. Happy Friday. We're back with Cibonay Jimenez speaking to us about sexual assault in Indian communities, Native communities. We are recording this presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand. I will be monitoring that in the chat. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Cibonay, and turn off my camera.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joy. And thank you all for joining us on this Friday morning. I know that Fridays are kind of the end of the week and sometimes energy is a little bit low, but I hope that you're kicking off your weekend well and having a beautiful morning so far. I wanted to kind of just start off with, a couple of moments of just letting you know who I am and kind of introducing myself, as well as, centering ourselves with the land acknowledgement. But as Joy mentioned, my name is Cibonay Jimenez, and my tribal affiliation is Yoeme, or also known as Yaqui and Casanwamares. And I'm just super honored to be in the space today. And so, Joy, if you can jump to the next slide, and it'll show a picture of some of the land that I've been to. And with this slide, I really just wanted to kind of ground not only myself, but kind of just this virtual space in acknowledging and taking a moment to acknowledge, the land that we are all zooming in from. And I personally am zooming in from the unceded lands of the Nisenan, Maidu, and Miwok peoples. And those nations are the traditional people of what is now known as Sacramento, California. And it's interesting because the land acknowledgement that I do formally in presentations like this has kind of transformed over the years. And as a little girl, I can't remember a time where I didn't do a land acknowledgement. I remember traveling with my dad. I remember doing work in tribal communities. And I remember anytime we went anywhere, even as we woke up, right, we were constantly acknowledging and validating and giving thanks and honoring those people where, wherever we were. But a lot of people didn't see that and didn't notice it, right? If it wasn't meaningful to them. And so as I transitioned to, including a more formal land acknowledgement, I always kind of talk a little bit about how this isn't something that is new, right? Acknowledging those peoples, those indigenous communities that are from those areas, who have been caretakers of those areas, who continue to thrive in those areas. Doing that formally for me is a way of putting action and also holding other people accountable as well. And I also know that it is very true that it is important for us to be mindful that there is a long-standing history with colonization, as well as the impacts of colonization that directly impacts the work that each of us do every single day. Those root causes of trauma and that impact of colonization impacts the topic that I'm talking about today, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And it's really important that we acknowledge that and that we figure out ways that we can provide information, but also connect, history to what is happening today in the work that we're doing. So with that, I really do honor those traditional homelands. I keep them in my heart and prayers, not only throughout this presentation, but also in all of the work that I do. And I don't want to make any assumptions that people know whose land they are on. So I'm just putting a link and a text number in the chat in case anybody would like to find out whose land you're on, or pass that information along, when you're doing presentations or when you're working with folks who may not know that information as well. Joy, go ahead and move to the next slide. Okay, so we're gonna, I'm gonna play a personal story actually, and I'm gonna talk a little bit more about it afterwards. But with this, I wanted to just preface the media with that this is a personal story that's gonna introduce me a little bit deeper, right? And I created this digital story as a part of my own healing journey. few years back, trying to think now, probably, 6 years ago or so, 7 years ago. And I've just recently started sharing it more in the last couple of years. It's when I worked at a mainstream organization, but I'll talk a little bit more about that after. But go ahead and press play, Joy.
Next, tokaroka witsitsili. When I was first asked to share a story with all of you, I was honored and humbled. For my people, storytelling and story sharing is a very intimate process. One of the women in my life that I respect immensely refers to this process as ceremony. It is this very simple yet complex process of orality that is rooted in our Indigenous philosophies. It is our way of teaching, bonding, and healing. So I invite you all to participate in this ceremonial journey with me. It is my hope that by opening up my heart and offering my vulnerable self, that you will be able to take something away from it that will help guide the work that we all do. At a very early age, I knew personally the difference between healthy, unhealthy, and abusive relationships. Domestic violence from an innocent child's perspective is something that will always be with me. And when I was molested at 12 years old and then later sexually assaulted in junior high school, I realized that my own experiences with these traumas would shape the work that I later did. The response that I experienced in my own trauma treatment forced me to look at how agencies were responding to and treating domestic violence and sexual assault survivors of diverse populations. During these storms, when I needed the most help, I received care from people and agencies that couldn't truly see or identify what I needed. They could not see nor understand the layers of historical and intergenerational trauma, the intricate spiritual and cultural components, or the worldview that I came with. Traditionally, this would be the time for a girl to begin transitioning into young womanhood. The little girl in me felt invisible and betrayed. I experienced stereotypes and microaggressions from some very ignorant providers, but mostly from the most well-intentioned providers. From providers teasing me about my name and not caring to learn how to say it properly, to feeling misunderstood when I explained my traditional ways, such as my coming of age ceremony and the ways of healing. It was not until I was 25 years old and in graduate school that I truly started my healing journey when I was triggered during the birth of my second son. At this time, I sought traditional healers and women professionals that were able to walk in both worlds to help me. In graduate school, I focused most of my research on Indigenous family and tribal trauma, the history and roots of it, the current issues and trends, and how to heal our present-day relatives and future generations to come. My experience, research, and work allowed me to understand why the intervention and treatment that many Native Americans receive, including myself, is so unhelpful and even sometimes further harming. After healing my own wounds, I started working with programs, tribes, and agencies that had domestic violence and sexual assault programs in addition to other programs. I worked with these entities to develop and strengthen the training of their staff, create and improve policies and procedures, and provide client services. I found that working with the Native tribes and agencies was different than working with the non-Native ones. The foundation and historical building blocks of these different types of entities were extremely different. One of a very Western and feminist foundation and practice, and the other from what Choctaw historian and writer Devin Mahishwa called a tribalist or communityist foundation. The technical assistance and direct services that I provided to each of these entities and the clients differed greatly as a result of this, and how I was received and treated differed. The microaggressions were sometimes shocking and unbearable, and I questioned whether I should be working with non-Native entities or even belonged in this field at all. I chose to work at the Sacramento Native American Health Center for many years, and while overseeing several programs, including the domestic violence program there, I realized that I could in fact be helpful to my own community and others by working with non-Native entities again. I began increasing my consulting to these other agencies and focused on what some people would consider debatable territory. I educated and shared historical and cultural information that would be helpful for these agencies to create and implement culturally sensitive services for Native Americans and other diverse populations. When a close friend of mine encouraged me to apply for a position at Weave, I hesitated greatly. I feared that I may be expected to or pressured to conform to the Western feminist models. I feared that I would be the token Native and lose myself. Instead, what I found in myself is the ability to continue to be creative and have a role in how agencies such as Weave respond to survivors from a victim-centered, trauma-informed, culturally sensitive approach. The field refers to these models as new, yet they are rooted in Indigenous epistemologies. Knowing this is humbling and validates my place here at this moment. Working with advocates and activists from many walks of life is an honor and has really become a gift. In this capacity, am I confronted with adaptive challenges? Yes. Each day, I encounter and internally struggle with many. For example, I was asked recently to bring together a group of Asian Pacific Islander panelists, and I battled with the concept of requesting their participation without earning their trust. Some days, I work with clients that share similar cultural beliefs, and I can connect with their frustration with some of the guidelines and services that they receive within the very programs that I manage. I am challenged by working for a mainstream domestic violence sexual assault agency where some days I feel very invisible and marginalized. But at the same time, I have found allies and people that can connect at the very human level. Humans that are open to humility. So today, as a wounded healer that does meaningful work both within my community and at a mainstream domestic violence sexual assault agency, I walk with the name given to me, Cibonay, which means for the people.
Go ahead and stop that. And you can go ahead. Yeah, you can go ahead and go to the next slide while I talk a little bit about that. So, you know, as I mentioned before, like this is very personal to me, and I have not shared this super widely, and it's usually within spaces like this when Strong Hearted has asked me to present, or you know, in a couple of other smaller spaces. But you know, how I show up to do this work and even this presentation is really, really important, you know, in terms of like who I am and why I do this work, right? So I'm a Native woman. I'm a Native visitor to the area that I live. I'm a survivor, right, as well. And, you know, I bring that with myself and, you know, in everything that I do. And I'm also on a healing journey. And in my story, I talk a lot about some of the things that we're going to continue to talk about, you know, in this presentation with regards to challenges and barriers, with regards to, you know, lack of services or lack of inappropriate services, some of the unique things that Native survivors might experience, right? And even though I don't work at that same organization now, I currently also work for mainstream organizations, not only for my job, but in a lot of times in some of my consultant work. And I dedicate a lot of my time working with tribal communities still. And so there's this balance, and there's still that push and pull and differences, right? And, you know, a lot of that collision is sometimes with frameworks and perspectives. And you know, one of the ones that I call out in the story is that, you know, within Western organizations, sometimes, you know, being bound to particular policies and procedures that are not necessarily from a Native perspective and are not in the best interest of Native survivors. You know, when I think about feminist frameworks and I think about what it means to be a tribalist, right, a communityist, like sometimes those things don't align and are not the same. And so those are some of the challenges that, you know, we'll continue to talk about. But I did want to kind of be transparent, you know, and too, that that this work, a lot of us do it for particular reasons. a lot of us work with our communities, and those are also challenges as well. And so for this presentation, I really, this is a topic, it's ginormous, and we can talk for hours and days and weeks, and still have more to talk about with regards to how to better, center Native survivors with regards to sexual assault and violence against Native communities. But really today's purpose is just to provide a general overview, right? And I really want to focus on the historical connections between colonization and sexual assault and violence towards Native communities, because, when we look at how do we really end sexual assault for Native people in tribal communities and so forth, we have to really look at root causes, right? Root causes, and that means we have to look, behind us. And the other part of today's presentation is looking at, again, those challenges, looking at those disparities and inequities that we have seen and continue to see, right? And that way we know where to focus, we know where that root cause of disruption is. And then look at things from an intersectionality framework in terms of like what else is connected, right? And figuring out how we can work within those areas as well. And then looking at the strengths and resiliency, not only of Native communities, but Native survivors, and looking at how do we use that strength and resiliency in implementing innovative strategies. And then the last part is towards the end, just holding some space for some discussion in terms of like, what can we each do personally? How can we hold our organizations accountable? How do we, share that responsibility in terms of centering and uplifting Native voices? Because that is part of the problem, right? That invisibility that we continue to have as Native survivors, as tribes, as tribal communities, as Native organizations, and how do we shift that power, within this movement? So go ahead and switch slides. And so with this slide, I never know who I'm presenting to, right, and who's kind of in the space. So I always want to just provide some general information with regards to what sexual assault is, because I don't want to make any assumptions, right? And that's part of the challenge in this work in itself, is that along the way for survivors, there are oftentimes a lot of assumptions made. And that is something we're trying to break down, right? We're trying to unlearn those biases and making assumptions. And so I don't want to assume that everybody even knows what sexual assault is. And so I included this slide just to briefly name what sexual assault is. And so sexual conduct is, or behavior that occurs without explicit consent. So again, even though it's very simple, oftentimes we find ourselves like, I'm not really sure what this is referencing. So it can include physical or psychological trauma. It can include a number of different things, such as the forms on the slide, and those are just some of the forms, right? So you have attempted rape, fondling or unwanted sexual touching, forcing to perform sexual acts, and then of course penetration, which is also known as rape. And a lot of times with sexual assault, initially we tend to focus so specifically on the physical trauma, or the initial healing, the physical healing that needs to happen as a result of an incident, and we don't always understand that when a sexual assault survivor experiences that physically, they're also experiencing a complete loss in all other areas, right? And so understanding the complexity, even though the definition may seem simple, the complexity of what sexual assault is much deeper than that. Next slide. So on that last slide, it shows some statistics that kind of generally name the problem that we have within the United States regarding sexual assault for the general population. And with everyone in all communities, sexual assault, sexual violence is really, really high. And it's a public health issue, right? It's been named and prioritized as a public health issue nationally, right? And we know that, and we also know that those incidents and those experiences are underreported. So even though we have data that shows that that is happening in all communities at very high rates, we also know that it is happening at a higher rate than what we can report out. And then this slide is just emphasizing that, you know, we already know that this is happening at really high rates for everyone. But when you look at data that specifically looks at how it is impacting Native survivors and Native communities, we know that it is even higher than the general population, right? And we know that there's still data that is not being reported. We still know that there are, you know, flaws within that data, and so we can only know that, you know, this is a huge problem within Indian country as well. And so some of the statistics that I've included on this particular slide, you know, are just to kind of show, you know, that, and again, you're looking at those disproportionate impacts on Native communities. So on average, you know, American Indians ages 12 and older experience about 6,000 sexual assaults per year. You know, we know that American Indians are twice as likely to experience a rape or sexual assault compared to all races. We know that something that is uniquely different for Native survivors is that there are really, really high rates of these incidents that are committed by a stranger, right? And many, many, many of them are committed by non-Native, on Native folks, right? And so that is something that is a little bit different than, you know, other communities. And we also know that we have a lot of data with regards to, again, other things that are happening in those intersectional pieces and root causes. We know that Native women who have experienced childhood sexual abuse are about 10 times more likely to experience sexual assault later in life. And we also know that those with a parent that attended a residential school, so you're looking at those boarding schools, right, that historical experience, right, with boarding schools, that they are also more likely by 2.35 times to have been sexually assaulted, right? And so you start to see through these data trends, you start to see these connections. And again, there are a lot of flaws with data, and we also have data that looks different. We have data that says, you know, Native survivors are 2 times more or twice as likely. We have other data that says they're 3 times as likely. And, you know, but what we do know and we can agree on is that this is happening at much higher rates within Native communities and on Native people, right? And so that's what I want you to remember. I don't want you to necessarily focus or zone in on, is it 2 times or is it 3 times or, you know, for this purpose anyway, but I want you to just understand that it is happening at a disproportionate rate for Native communities. Next slide. So to kind of hone in a little bit deeper on this area of looking at how history is connected, I've included this animated vignette that was created by SCUI. And SCUI is the California Consortium for Urban Indian Health. In the past, I've done a lot of work with them, particularly with their Red Women Rising project, which they continue to have and have amazing Native staff working on that. But this digital tool was created as a way to talk about that historical connection. And so I like showing this within presentations, but also it's a tool that you can take and show in communities with your staff as a way to open up some conversation about the topic as well. So I'm going to go ahead and play it, Joy.
I think in contemporary Native communities, we do have a lot of Western patriarchal influence that allows for things like victim blaming, but also this incredible silence that often exists around violence, domestic violence, and sexual assault. What they say often about the silence around domestic violence is that we as Indian people have to learn to talk about it, to let people who have been victims of it know that there's nothing wrong with speaking about their experience. If you look at a pre-colonial Native culture, most women did not cover their breasts. And that tells you something very specific about the role of women in this culture. They're not being objectified for their bodies. They are able to exist in a place where they don't cover up, and yet you don't see very high instances of any kind of sexual violence. When you look at the people who are coming in and settling the Americas, they could bring in tons and tons of these soldiers, these men who they say are very uneducated, and they're covered in lice, and they are unshaven and unclean, and they're like a plundering horde. And what they really equate Native women with is the land itself. And so they feel entitled to the land, they feel entitled to the gold, they feel entitled to the women. For a lot of people, there is still this feeling like we don't have an adequate justice system to address all of these issues of colonization. The system is built on settler colonialism. So when you speak up against what's happening to you or to your family, when you talk about it, when you put it out there, you're trusting in a Western justice system to do something about it when they often won't. It's a majority non-Native people that commit violence against Native people. And when it comes to domestic violence, the statistics say that it's not Native men who are perpetuating violence against Native women.
With domestic violence, a lot of times we forget how important we are. You know, and I feel like when you're in a tribal circle, you're part of a community, and the circle helps the people. It helps lift that burden off of them, and that in itself is healing. And I feel like being open and vulnerable to share those feelings shows how strong you are. If you could do it, then you're showing another person that they can do it too. So it starts with us.
You are a part of something important. You are a part of a community. That community values everything that you are and everything that you're going to do. And you're not alone. So even when somebody comes into your life who wants to make you feel like you are less than, like you are nothing, you know from your core that that is not the truth. That you are very much valued for who you are as a person in this world.
So as I mentioned, I really love that animated vignette because in a couple of minutes, you know, it talks about this this connection between our past, present, and future, right? And as Native peoples, we know that is a reality, that, you know, there are connections. You know, I know that as Native people, part of our lens, our perspective, one of our ways of being is understanding that, you know, we are thinking of generations past and present and future, right? And so, and looking at those impacts. But sometimes when we're doing this work, particularly, you know, a challenge with doing this work and working with mainstream organizations and non-tribal communities is sometimes that is not understood, right? And so we have to revisit and look at those connections as a way to try to understand, you know, what is happening today. And so again, the video shows that, you know, the historical experience and impact with colonization. It looks at how gender roles have shifted. It looks at what has been experienced by not only Native women and children, but our people, the land, right? Looking at that history of invisibility, and then looking at the connections between sexual violence for our communities. And so, you know, again, I like to show things that can be reused as tools in your own conversations. And so I hope that that is something that is helpful. Go ahead and move to the next slide. So with this slide, again, I wanted to kind of focus a little bit on that intersectionality piece that I keep saying, and that, you know, we're hearing in that story, but also that I know you are aware of as you move about in the work that you're doing. And some of the things when we say intersectionality or connections, right, or how things are related, some of the things are really easy to make connections with. So for example, domestic violence or intimate partner violence and sexual assault, sexual violence, right? A lot of times we move within those different areas, or they're happening, to the same person. We also know that missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit peoples is another area that, is very, very connected when we say sexual violence. Those things are kind of wrapped into each other. And a lot of times we are working within intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and missing and murdered Indigenous peoples, right? And so the other one is trafficking, right? We're looking at sex trafficking, but also just trafficking in general. That's another one that we tend to kind of see and are aware of, day to day. The other ones sometimes, again, are a little bit, we need a reminder in order to kind of dig deeper, but also to be able to fully help our survivors, in terms of what their needs are. And those other ones are listed on the slide. And then there are so many more, right? So we're looking again at that racial justice piece, right? We're looking at things like healthcare access, right? We're looking at housing and homelessness, substance use, mental health, education, parenting and caregiving, and so much more, right? And so this little graph on this bottom of the slide was taken from a study that the Garden of Truth did, and they had a study group on Native women in Minneapolis, right? And this was some years back, but it looked at about 105 women who had been victims of sex trafficking, and it asked them about other issues or challenges that they felt that they had, or that, other services that they have used, right? And so what it really validates is this concept of intersectionality and survivors needing so much more than just, again, that physical healing or treatment of a wound that may have happened in that moment. And so on the graph, it looks like, it looks at the experience with child sexual abuse, right? It looks at, drug dependency. It looks at homelessness. It, asks if they had stayed in a homeless shelter, right? If they've used domestic violence services, right? And all of these different things. And there were other areas included. This is just kind of a snapshot of some of them. But what we see is that, again, there are needs beyond the needs of the incident of sexual violence that had just occurred. And so when we start to look at how do we address the needs of Native survivors, it means we need to understand what else is impacting Native communities and Native women and Native children and Native peoples, as well. And that means we need to kind of work on things such as our screening tools, right? In terms of how we're responding to crises and our intervention strategies and things like that we'll talk about in just a moment. Next slide. Awesome. So I wanted to kind of just spend a moment, and I included this slide on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit peoples, really again to kind of just help us understand what else is happening, not only in the United States, but this movement is international. It actually officially sparked as a movement, outside of the United States and Canada, but within the United States, our tribal communities and Native activists have been looking at this for decades, right? For 500 plus years in terms of what is happening and how are people responding differently when a Native person goes missing or is murdered, right? And so again, we have a lot of data that shows that, we have missing community members that is happening at much, much higher rates. And not only is it happening at high rates, but it is not being addressed, so the inequity piece is really large. So I've included a little bit of data, but I also wanted to kind of just include, some of the more recent things. And that is the image or photo to the bottom right. And this meme is a meme that was created and surfaced in the fall of last year, late summer, early fall of last year, in response to the Gabby Petito case. For those that are not aware of what that is Gabby Petito is a young white woman who was reported missing in late August of last year, and was later found, murdered. But the intent with some of these conversations that have happened and the memes that have come out and the artwork and images and there were a lot of movement at that time, and it was really just addressing again that invisibility piece, right? That in that consistent lack of prioritization of when these things happen to our Native community members. And so the intent was to not minimize what happened to Gabby, but instead to again highlight this disparity that has happened for Native communities for a really, really long time. And so there continues to be a push and advocacy for visibility, right? For centering Native survivor voices and working closely to kind of again eliminate those gaps and challenges and barriers that have and continue to exist, that really has impacted the way that we respond to these incidents and to finding missing folks, to investigating and to having justice, right? Next slide. So this video is just a few minutes long, and it goes a little bit deeper in terms of not only looking at sexual violence, but violence, in general towards Native people. And this particular video, again, looks at some of the findings and the intersections and connections between that physical violence, that sexual violence, but looking at the psychological piece of it, right? And looking at how are we finding survivors and their impact in these other areas. So go ahead and press play, Joy.
The stories of American Indians and Alaska Natives are as varied and nuanced as the people themselves. But the latest study from the National Institute of Justice finds one troubling through line that links these stories: the experience of high rates of violence. Like songs and oral histories, science can raise awareness by quantifying the severity of violence. It's time to hear what the numbers are saying. The vast majority of American Indian and Alaska Native women and men have experienced violence in their lifetime, and 1 in 3 have experienced recent violence in the past year. Those levels are higher than the general population, but that's not where the inequalities end. The study also measures a range of impacts as well as services needed because of violence. What's behind those numbers? Let's start with the finding that for American Indians and Alaska Natives, violence doesn't discriminate by gender. Women and men share similar rates of victimization. That means almost 3 million American Indian and Alaska Native women and men have been victims of violence. To put that number in perspective, imagine if everyone in the state of Iowa stood up, or every resident of Orlando, Dallas, Detroit, Anchorage, and Atlanta combined. That's the scale of the violence. But what about the scope? The NIJ study breaks types of violence into 4 categories, and violence against American Indians and Alaska Natives is high across all of them. Take stalking, for example. It can be a gateway to more aggressive violence, and repeated, unwanted, fear-inducing experiences come in many forms. Lifetime estimates of stalking for women in the study are almost double those of non-Hispanic whites. Add male and female victims together, and that's more than 1.2 million people. That would fill 20 sports stadiums if every single ticket holder had been stalked. Being forced or coerced to engage in unwanted sexual activity is another form of violence, a form all too familiar to American Indians and Alaska Natives. For example, these mothers, daughters, and sisters face almost 2 times the risk of sexual violence with penetration as non-Hispanic white women. Overall rates of physical violence by intimate partners in the past or present are even higher, from being shoved to having a gun or knife used on them. More than 1 in every 2 women and more than 1 in every 3 men have experienced physical violence by intimate partners in their lifetimes, comparatively much higher than the physical victimization rates over the lifetimes of non-Hispanic whites. Of course, not all violence is sexual or physical, so the NIJ study also examined psychological aggression. For example, expressions of anger that seem dangerous or humiliating, or controlling access to birth control. Overall, psychological aggression affects more than 1 in every 2 women and men. Psychological aggression may not be as obvious as broken bones or bruises, but it is real. Among victims, 63% of women report partners tracking them, and 55% of women report being kept from family or friends. These are just a few findings, but remember, they are numbers that correspond to real victims who would fill the entire state of Iowa. Now picture if 97% of women and 90% of men in Iowa were victimized by people of other races and ethnicities, interracial perpetrators who violated the safety of their schools, workplaces, parks, homes, and bedrooms. Numbers alone. Dangerous gap. Most federally recognized tribes don't have the legal authority to criminally prosecute non-Indians, even for crimes committed on tribal lands. So, what does it all mean? The impacts of high rates of violence against American Indians and Alaska Natives range from missed days of work or school to physical injuries. It's not surprising that services are needed, like medical care to treat injuries. But here's where the NIJ results uncover another glaring disparity. Almost 40% of female victims who need services can't get them, compared with only 15% of non-Hispanic white female victims who fall through the cracks. American Indians and Alaska Natives deserve better, and now there is science to prove it. These numbers are not abstract. They bear witness to real people, mothers, girlfriends, brothers, and grandfathers. Our hope is that this study will lead to a story of a new beginning, one where all of us listen to what the science is saying, what the victims are saying, and unite to prevent violence wherever it happens.
The next slide, Joy.
The stories of American Indians and Alaska Natives.
Did it just go back?
Yeah, I think, I don't know if it was. There we go.
Okay, sorry.
No worries. Okay, so that, again, video was created by the National Institute of Justice, a few years back. And again, I like it because it's a great tool to kind of use to open some of these conversations, right? And it zones in on, these different areas of violence that very much connect, right? And we know that, again, that those that are doing harm with regards to sexual violence on Native people, a lot of times, are, very high rates of non-Native people, doing this harm. And, this next slide really kind of moves into this conversation of, okay, what are some of the challenges and barriers for Native survivors, right? So we know now, and we have known that these acts of violence are impacting Native people, Native communities disproportionately, right? Much higher than the general population. We know that. So what is happening, in response to those, and what are some of the challenges and barriers for these Native survivors, when they are coming to get help, or why are they not coming to get help, and so forth, right? And so this slide gives some of the challenges and barriers, right? So this is in no way a complete list, right? And we consistently see different things with different survivors and different communities, right? It's different for each incident. But these are some of the ones that we continue to see surface and are kind of some common themes when we're working with Native survivors. And so again, that historical experience of colonization, and some of the ways that that becomes a challenge or a barrier is that a lot of times when someone is seeking help, right, there isn't an understanding of that root cause of trauma, right? There isn't understanding of what is the next bullet in terms of that compound trauma that may exist, right? And so a lot of times when we get a victim, we're trying to kind of just put out the fire, right? And sometimes we are not doing the best job to really address the whole trauma experience and how that one particular incident is impacting, you know, everything, and how everything is impacting that incident, right? And that is a really, really difficult piece, because a lot of times our role is to do crisis response, to de-escalate, right? To, you know, just, you know, make it in that moment to kind of level it out so that then we can move forward. But a lot of times what we're seeing is that there isn't even an awareness that there are these other things happening, and you know, we tend to miss things, right? We also a lot of times don't understand that that historical experience with colonization has other impacts, such as a mistrust, right? Such as you know, there are stories in our communities that, you know, give us information, and sometimes if we're trying to provide services and we are not aware of those things, and we're not, you know, culturally aware of what might be happening as well, then that can be a challenge or barrier as well. You know, just not even being culturally aware of you know, what might be happening. You know, in my personal story, I talked about when I was trying to, you know, get help and there was intervention as a very young girl. At the same time, I was preparing for my coming of age ceremony. I was, you know, doing these things that were very culturally specific. And a lot of times when explaining some of those things, they may not be understood in the, you know, in the way that they are intended. Or, you know, to be honest, I've talked to survivors who have said, you know, I've mentioned that one of my coping mechanisms is talking to my ancestors, right? And then they've mentioned that their therapist was like, okay, like, let me do a psychological assessment. Let me do this. Like, I'm not sure. And so sometimes even then within that mental health field, you know, that has been a challenge and barrier in terms of like, okay, like, is this a cultural piece? Is it, you know, what is happening? And so again, sometimes the awareness in itself, you know, will help us ask questions or be curious or allow for space for the survivor to tell us what is happening, right? Another challenge and barrier is, again, that lack of trust with not only first responders and, you know, those that may be initially responding, such as law enforcement, but also healthcare providers, right? You know, I know that even very recently, there has been many IHS clinics, tribal clinics, that have been exposed with regards to their providers sexually abusing young children or women, right? There are stories of forced sterilization in hospitals when our family members have gone for, you know, help, right? There have been large numbers of deaths that have occurred, you know, of Native people going to hospitals or going to jail, or, you know, just different areas. And so again, that lack of trust with many, many systems, you know, is deeply rooted as a result of colonization, but also a result of systemic racism and inequities that has existed and continues to exist in these systems. The next one is limited resources, right? And so not only are there limited resources within all, you know, organizations, mainstream organizations, but for tribes and for communities, there are limited resources generally, and there are even more limited resources when you're looking at providing culturally responsive services, right? And so that's the other piece. And limited resources to provide the services outside of the immediate response a lot of times, right? So when we're talking about the importance of intersectionality, but then we don't have the resources, the funding, you know, the capacity to address those intersectional pieces, such as housing, for example, that is, a limited resource. That is a resource capacity, piece. And that leads to kind of like, again, the inadequate resources. Another really, really large challenge is jurisdictional, right? And this presentation doesn't go very deeply into that piece, but we have very complex jurisdictional issues and challenges for Native survivors and Native communities, right? You have, concepts of these nations within a nation, when you're looking at tribal sovereignty and autonomy, right? When you're looking at tribal court systems, right? California as a public law 280 state. When you're looking at things, I'm fully aware of ICWA, but on the last session, somebody mentioned ICWA, so I added it to the slide in terms of, the very tedious processes of ICWA, right? And kind of the flaws and pieces of ICWA that, we see happen when we see sexual assault, cases. Cultural factors, again, talked a little bit about that already. In terms of the shame and stigma and victim blaming, again, we know that, for everyone, this is a huge piece, but then even more so in Native communities, because we have also internalized a lot of the colonization that has happened to us, things such as lateral oppression, right? Lateral shame, all of those different pieces. In our communities, we continue to struggle, and sometimes that leads to additional victim blaming, right? And so this is something that we see and that we're working really diligently on kind of addressing within tribal communities and within our own communities as a way to decolonize ourselves as well. Others are, the other one I wanted to kind of just highlight is the confidentiality piece. And, when I say confidentiality, there's a piece of, yes, confidentiality breaching, right? And kind of like that piece of it. But when I'm talking about confidentiality in tribal communities, I'm more talking about how we have a very knit community. We are very close. And because of that, a lot of times we are concerned about confidentiality, not in the sense of, okay, you may break HIPAA, but more in the sense of, okay, my cousin is the victim advocate at the tribal clinic. So maybe I don't want her to know my story. I don't want her to know what I'm going through or what I have gone through. Or, I know that maybe the tribal program or the IHS clinic has a program, but also the person who did harm, their family member works in a department there, right? Or, our rural community, there are other survivors that may be attending this, group or this program, and I don't really feel comfortable talking about my issues in front of them, right? And so it's more of that type of challenge of confidentiality that I'm talking about, which is really, there's a huge reason why it's important to collaborate and have partnerships with non-Native, service providers, because it's important for survivors to have options outside of the tribal programs, outside of the culturally specific organizations, right? I am a strong advocate and believer in, in the culturally specific organizations and the tribal programs. Those are really important, and definitely, a lot of my work is kind of helping to build the capacity of those programs, right? But on the other end, if we don't have other options for survivors who don't want to go that route, then we are doing a disservice for those survivors, and those survivors will then fall through the cracks, right? And so again, looking at those pieces. We also know that, in rural and remote areas, that's a challenge when we're looking at transportation and childcare and access to, those other services that are very much needed. And then also looking at, a very limited piece of services that may be an option for survivors. Next slide, Joy. Thank you. And so what does this look like for Native survivors then, in terms of needs, right? What does it look like? Again, these are the rights for all sexual assault, victims on, that are on this slide. and so most programs are kind of thinking from this lens, like, okay, survivors are, have the right to a quick medical assessment, to a, evidentiary exam, to law enforcement, to advocacy, right, to STI screenings, all of these different things that are, obviously oftentimes written directly into protocols for responding to sexual assault, or for formal SART teams, right? So sexual assault response teams that are required and, have a very strong protocol with regards to what are the rights of sexual assault survivors. But what does this look like for Native survivors is sometimes different than what it may look like for other survivors, right? And so looking at, some of the very obvious things, again, if we know a challenge and barrier is, culturally responsiveness, then sometimes that means we have to look at it from a Native lens and say, okay, if we know that there's a right to have intervention and services, like what would that look like for a Native survivor? Well, that may mean, looking at interventions and crisis response, from a traditional perspective. It may include interventions such as ceremony, community response, culture, things like that, right? Another one that is, kind of easier to point out is like the justice, so it is the right of a survivor to seek justice, to have justice, right? And so for Native survivors, one of the things that has been, very, very, active communication and conversations about is, what does justice look like for Native survivors, right? And what are the options, right? And that is the piece, again, what are the options? Historically, it's been an option to go through, our criminal justice system and, in the same ways that all survivors have. And a lot of times we know that when we're looking at justice, sometimes it's justice for, from a family approach, from a community approach. Sometimes it looks like restorative justice, right? Like how are we maintaining or restoring the balance that was done by the sexual assault, right? And so those options a lot of times are not initially offered for survivors, but for a Native survivor, that may be important. So those type of options. So again, looking at how this might look differently for Native survivors is really important. Next slide. Okay, so again, this one I'm gonna kind of just brush over a little bit because I already talked a lot about this, but what I had wanted to kind of outline with this slide and this information is looking more at like, how are we responding to a whole person, right? How are we understanding the complex whole of a survivor who has experienced sexual assault? And how are we providing crisis response and healing services, to that whole person, right? So when you're looking at it from a human perspective, a human approach, we have to understand that, each of us show up with all of who we are, right? So that is not only who we are as Native people, as a Native person, our cultural practices. So, we have over 500 tribes in the United States, right? Federally recognized tribes, and, a ton of other non-recognized tribes. In California alone, over 110, right? And so we have to understand that even though we may be working with Native survivors, each Native survivor is a whole complex person that brings not only their own cultural beliefs and perspectives and values and worldview, but also, who they are, in terms of their enrollment status, their identity, how they culturally connect, right? Some Native people don't culturally connect, right? Whether or not, there are religious or spiritual practices, our gender and sexual identities, right? Like all of these different things are how we show up, right? And so if all of those make up who we are and how we show up in any moment, then we know those pieces are important for someone who has experienced sexual assault as well. We know that a person's trauma impacts are related. We know that coping strategies oftentimes are related to, our experiences, right? To our capacity. Whether or not we trust people, again, it's related to our experience, what we know, our own truths. And so we have to remember that those cultural considerations and everything, and are really important for us to respond holistically, right? Next slide. Okay, so this is the one, again, the slide that I a lot of times when we're kind of in more interactive spaces, I like to hear other areas of innovative strategies. So feel free to put things in the chat if you're thinking of things as I'm talking on the slide too. But when we think of innovative strategies, it's interesting because over the last decade, there's been a lot more language in terms of innovative strategies, innovative approaches, and in grant, language, and looking at practice-based evidence and evidence-based, practice, and all of these different things. We're starting to kind of see more validation for what we're calling innovative strategies. But what these are is really just things that have existed historically for our traditional communities, right? It's basically our indigenous protocols for prevention, intervention, and healing, right? And so, I always want to validate that a lot of the things that we're doing when we talk about human-centered approach, right? Tribalist, views, like all of those things are indigenous values, are indigenous protocols that we've always had. And it's important that we kind of center those frameworks when we're looking at how are we responding to Native survivors of sexual assault and other areas as well. And so really what this is saying is that culture is the root of these prevention efforts. Culture is the root of these crisis response strategies, of these healing frameworks. And so that means our stories, that means our ceremonies, that means language, that means culture, right? And all of the practices, the routine and the seasonality pieces of our ways. It means our traditional foods, right? Our food ways. And when I say this looks very different for different communities. As I mentioned, we have so many tribes and so many different ways, right? And in tribal communities in Indian country, we know that there are multiple ways of doing things, and there are multiple ways that are rooted in the same value, right? And so this may look very differently for different communities or for different survivors, but keeping in mind that we know that a connection to our traditional foods, to gathering, to growing, to processing, to all of those, to cooking, right? All of those ways of being in community or surrounding food, we know that that is a healing way. And a lot of communities have lost some of these ways, right? And so sometimes it may look like a revitalization or relearning. And other times, a lot of communities have not lost these ways, right? And they know and are practicing them. And so I don't want to make the assumption that it's more of a revitalization or it's a maintenance or continuance, right? But the important thing to remember is that, like this is the healing, like this is the value of restoring balance a lot of times for Native survivors. Next slide. And so I wanted to show this very brief clipping of a Native trafficking survivor as a way to pivot us into kind of talking a little bit more about resiliency and strength. So go ahead and play.
That's what they look for in prostitution and pimps and everything.
Trafficking is a big problem in our community. We do look at it as a direct effect of colonization, since it's been going on since first contact with Columbus, right? He trafficked young women to Europe. 8, 9 were popular according to his journals.
I was born with alcohol syndrome and crack in my system. I was adopted at 2, so into a good family and everything. Growing up good, everything was fine. Till I started at high school, met a guy, he changed my whole life. I was really young, only like 13, and I was doing cocaine, prostituting, doing drugs, selling drugs, really young. He was making me do whatever he said.
As a nation, we have not reconciled with the effect that development of this country has had on the indigenous population. And so all of the issues are made to be invisible.
It was years of the same things. Money for sex, money for drugs, money for whatever he wanted me to do.
People don't see us, and they don't see us as real people, or we're a caricature. And so people have been able to look the other way for a very long time.
And I found out I was pregnant. I didn't know who the baby dad was. All I cared about was money, drugs, and that's it. Didn't care about the baby inside of me. Like when I got about 8 months, I kind of felt like I can't do this no more. So I felt like maybe I should go home.
When tribal people moved into the urban settings back in the 50s, there wasn't an infrastructure here in place. And so when they got here, there were no jobs, and it created these intense pockets of poverty.
I went to my mom's house. She got me help. My parents didn't know nothing about it because I was a runaway. So after I talked to them finally, after all these years, I told them I was pregnant, and they made me feel more loved and cared for, not like I ever have.
We should talk more about the resilience of the people, that despite all of this that has happened, that we're still here.
I overcome that, and I'm not doing no drugs, and I feel like I don't have to ever again, because I did think that that was the way of life. Being like guarded down or like, pushed down was my life. I never thought I could get a job. I thought all I have to do was prostitute.
There's enough of us who have gone on to become professionals that we're coming back to serve our community, to pull everyone else up too. That's where we move forward instead of getting stuck in the past.
Because it's not okay for anybody to look at us and say, oh, she's Native, you know what they do, or you know how they were raised. I want to go to school. I want to be something to help other women and young girls, or even men that need help to get out the life, addiction, prostitution, anything.
Next slide.
And that's what they look for.
So as I mentioned, I like to use that video clip as a transition and kind of to pivot to, this conversation about Native strengths and resiliency, because my favorite part of that, story of that survivor story is, that her uplifting of resiliency, right? And I think that that's, sometimes we get caught up talking about the disparities and, the inequities and things like that, and kind of the challenges and gaps. And that is really, really important because we have to have those conversations. But what we sometimes then run out of time, with is the resiliency piece. And so again, looking at that is really important, because a lot of times when we are strength-based, when responding to survivors, a lot of times that is an open door to building trust as well, right? And not only should the motive be to build trust and kind of like that, but also that's the human-centered approach, right? That is, we know that is a best practice, right? And so when I talk about resiliency, again, for me, I usually will kind of highlight, these three types of resiliency that I call innate resiliency, responsive resiliency, and vicarious resiliency. And in some ways, these different types of resiliency are similar, right? And they can be even the same things, but sometimes they show up, in different times and in different places. And so when I say innate resiliency, I'm referring to those strengths and that, those innate pieces that just are there, right? So our culture, our language, our foods, our communities, our different personality pieces that have our strengths, right? Like all of our strengths that kind of each of us have that, may be the same for some of us or maybe very unique for others, right? So those pieces that we all kind of have embodied and are there and have gotten us this far already, right? Have gotten us through just normal like crisis, right? Like normal healthy stress, right? So when I say normal healthy stress, like maybe it's, preparing for a test, right? Or studying for the driving, test if you're a teenager, or getting through being a youth, right? And all of those hormones, or, getting through being a toddler and those developmental changes, right? Being a new mom and not knowing what the world to do, right? Like those type of normal challenges that we all struggle with, but in terms of our innate resilience gets us through it, right? And a lot of times those are the pieces that are not impacted by trauma, right? Those kinds of things. And then when I talk about responsive resilience, they can still be culture, they can still be, our strength something like organization, right? Like things like that, like, in terms of that. But instead, they're happening when we're responding to adversity, right? And so very, very early on, our Indigenous communities have had responsive resilience to colonization, right? To different things that happen as an impact of that, right? And we continue to activate with responsive resilience when things are happening, such as sexual violence, right? And so these can still be the same strengths and the same pieces, but they're surfacing and they're being activated in different ways in response to, what I call a not normal stress, right? A tragic stress. And unfortunately, a lot of these tragedies and tragic stresses have been normalized, right? They happen so frequently in our community. They happen within families and generations, right? And so a lot of times we're trying to still figure out, is this a normal stress? Is this just something that has happened? Like, we just hurt each other, violence, like, all of these different things. Or, are we responding to adversity to something that is, not necessarily traditional in our communities, right? And so that's kind of how I talk a little bit about responsive resiliency in terms of responding to adversity. And then the vicarious resilience is when we look at how is what we are being, how are we responding to what we are being impacted by when we are coming in contact with survivors, with communities. We talk a lot about vicarious trauma, right? And how the trauma that we see with the people that we work with, the communities that we work with, that can transfer onto our own, right? Our own selves, our own health. And, we end up being impacted by that trauma. So we talk about vicarious trauma, but we don't talk a lot about vicarious resilience, right? And so in that same way, the resilience of the folks that we are working with in the communities that we are serving and that we are in, that strength and that cultural resilience can also have a huge positive impact on ourselves as well, right? And so looking at it in that way, is really important as well. And looking again at the root of how culture can weave within these different types of resilience. Next slide. And so when we're looking at, particularly that vicarious resilience piece, I feel obligated to talk about self-care. And when I talk about self-care, it's interesting because, sometimes I do whole workshops on just, self-care, and I look at how radical self-care is traditional, right? And when I do these large workshops, of course, they're really comprehensive, but for today, I really wanted to, highlight that self-care is traditional, right? And a lot of times as Native people, we struggle with this concept of taking care of ourselves. A lot of times we are sometimes trying to figure out if it is selfish, right? And in reality, we sometimes overlook the fact that, traditionally, we did take care of ourselves in a lot of different ways. We also took care of our communities in a lot of different ways, right? Again, through those same practices that I mentioned in terms of, being ways of healing. So like our ceremonies, our traditional ways, our food ways, like all of those different things are in fact ways to take care of ourselves and to take care of our communities. And so this concept of self-care is not selfish, right? We cannot take care of our Native survivors if we are not well ourselves, right? And so, but what I like to talk about with regards to self-care and community care is that a lot of times when we say self-care, we immediately think, oh, spa day, right? Like, let me go for a walk, let me meditate, let me breathe, let me go get my toes done, let me, water the plants. Like we think of all of these things that, oftentimes are really easy to identify, and they are important, right? I don't want to minimize those things. They are important for our well-being and our self-care. But we also know that those are just like what we call like the surface pieces, right? And those are very good at kind of in the moment, taking care of our physical selves, our mental selves, our emotional selves. But I included this image of the self-care iceberg, and in that iceberg, it really, really focuses largely on what we talk about as being the core piece of self-care, right? And that's what's on the bottom, what's below the iceberg. And those things include our own trauma healing, right? Like, because as people, we also sometimes, even if we're not a survivor, if you're not a survivor and you're working with survivors, like there are triggers, right? In our Native communities, if we're not a survivor, we most likely know someone who's a survivor that's very close to us, right? And so it means doing our own trauma healing. It means doing our own inner child healing, whether it's related to sexual violence or any kind of violence, or the divorce of our parents or anything, right? But really, really addressing those pieces so that we are showing up as, a healing person ourselves, right? And not with those lingering pieces that have been unresolved. It means setting boundaries, right? Setting really strong boundaries, not only with our family members, but our clients, within our programs, and that is something that I see really, really often. I work a lot with home visitors, and we spend a lot of time looking at what does setting healthy boundaries actually look like, right? Not only for within their programs, but with, like I said, with their clients and their families. Sometimes that's as simple as like, are we available 24/7, right? Is that healthy to be available 24/7 if that's not, part of the program, right? Because we know that crisis response is 24/7, but, how do we set some boundaries to where that is not blurring into our personal lives, right? It means things like unlearning and decolonizing ourselves, right? And relearning and learning different approaches and different things and strategies that may be more helpful for when we're responding to survivors. It means having really difficult conversations sometimes, right? It means looking at things in our internal programs, right? In our own families. And then so again, these type of things are a little bit harder to grasp. They're a little bit harder to identify. And, so it means the work is a little bit harder, but they are the more important areas of self-care so that we can sustain ourselves and we can sustain the work that we're doing with survivors, right? And I talk a lot about radical self-care because we are modeling this for the folks that we are helping, right? When we are showing up and we are talking about self-care, and we should be having these conversations with survivors as well, right? When we're responding to them as part of that case management, as part of that crisis response, right? And providing resources for this and stuff. But they're gonna see through if you're not showing up authentically with someone who also is taking care of themselves, right? And so we have an opportunity to model these things for those that we are working with. And that is a really critical piece to how do we then center self-care for survivors, and it starts with centering it for ourselves. Next slide. Okay, so again, I know that, in this virtual space and WebEx kind of space, it's hard to have kind of an active conversation, but I wanted to kind of just provide an opportunity for anyone to ask questions and to also kind of address this question that I threw on the slide in terms of what can you do better to center Native survivor voices, right? And I put a couple of examples, here in terms of like, maybe it looks like addressing the screening processes in our organizations. Maybe it means looking at our policies and procedures, right? Sometimes, and one very, easy example to kind of mention is, in mainstream organizations, a lot of times there's a policy that talks about gifts. It talks about, not being allowed to accept any gifts whatsoever. And when we work with Native communities, we know that gifting and generosity is a core value for our communities. And so a lot of times that is something, I personally have received gifts, right? Like that, a small basket that they've woven, a poem, that kind of talks about their thing, right? So I'm not saying that we should have policies that say, ask for gifts or expect gifts or, accept any gift, right? Because there's a need for boundaries. But culturally, we have to know that, okay, like gifting is sometimes the only thing that a survivor can offer to truly show that they are authentically grateful for the help that you've given them, right? For the program, for whatever. And so if we have something that shuts down that opportunity for them to show it in that way, then we're not being culturally responsive, right? Another example that I, sometimes will give is, the food, right? We have a lot of our funders won't let us have food. A lot of our funders won't let us, incorporate food, but we know that food is really important, not only in building trust, but also in sometimes working through these very difficult things. Like our foodways are ways that we can make true, authentic connections, right? So what does that look like, in our programs? When I talk about, food, I also talk about, shelters. Are we providing culturally appropriate foods, right? Are we, providing access to the foods that they are most comfortable with eating, right? Things like that, right? Looking at SARTs, right? So sexually assault response teams, like, do we have SARTs in our communities that have the best partnerships, right, for these survivors, right? The best resources? Are the processes, intended to center Native survivors, right? Those kinds of things. Again, what does our partnerships with tribes and tribal communities look like? I know, like, with a lot of the work that I'm doing with one of the organizations that I work with, I talk a lot about, like, how are we reaching out to tribes? Like, how are we, responding to their needs? How are we centering? How are we passing the mic, right? Like, and a lot of times for mainstream organizations, there are not partnerships with, the tribes. I work with a lot of mainstream organizations in California, particularly domestic violence and sexual assault organizations. And when I talk about partnerships, a lot of times I'm like, well, I live in this city, right? And they'll name Sacramento, for example. And they're like, so I don't really see tribes around. And I'm like, okay, well, these are the closest tribes within minutes away, right? And this is what they're doing in their community. They have tribal courts. This is what, programs they have. And so the fact that they don't even know that there are tribes within, a few minutes, that is a problem, right? And so looking at what do those partnerships look like, and are they reciprocal partnerships, right? Education. So again, for me, not only education, personal education, right, and professional development for ourselves, but what does history have to do with it, right? And then how are we providing that education for, again, our partners, right, and for those that are responding to Native survivors? Because if they have a lack of education, then they're going to have a lack of perspective in response. Okay, and so this is where I want to kind of also open it up to what else with this question and this area of what can we do better to center these Native survivor voices, like what else is coming up? And so I'm going to just kind of pause for a moment to see if anyone wants to ask to be unmuted, or if anybody wants to throw something in the chat.
You can raise your hand, or you can just click on your microphone and it will unmute you.
And I know that these virtual spaces are oftentimes really quiet. And so, it's not a problem if nobody wants to kind of say anything at this time. But again, I like to kind of just offer the opportunity. Okay. Well, I do.
We have a hand up, Cibonay.
Okay.
So, April, I'm going to unmute you. And you're good to go.
Thank you. I've been thinking about this a lot, about, like in most conventional practice, you have to fill out the paperwork. And, what I'm envisioning is, do you want a cup of tea, coffee, water, here's some stew. I'm envisioning more like this is a safe space, like a living room. And I want people to be comfortable, and, and then I know that they'll be willing to share, but if you start out with that, fill out the paperwork stuff, you know, it just seems so impersonal.
Thank you. Thank you so much for mentioning that, because yes, that is how we've been historically trained, particularly in this field, right, as responders to sexual assault and direct services. Is there's this high priority for paperwork, right? And not only paperwork with like 4 questions, like massive paperwork, right? Like screenings upon screenings and, you know, questions, and they're super invasive, right? And so a lot of times the pressure is to, like, we need this information and we need you to sign for consent and we need you to sign this release and we need you to do this before we even ask if you're okay, right? And that's kind of how historically we've been trained. And then we wonder why survivors don't want to open up. We wonder why we're not getting to kind of like the core of what is happening, right? And so I love how you're talking about, like, I envision it like, you know, this space that is comfortable, right? Like a cozy home, right? Not some cold office, you know, with with a desk and a hard chair, right? Like those kinds of things. Very, very practical, right? I love how you're saying, like, I'm envisioning like some stew, right? Exactly. Like, I always tell people, you know, part of the work that I've done over the last 25 years too is working with providers, you know, primary care physicians, pediatricians, like SART, you know, medical examiners, like those. And a lot of the activities that I do in their training focuses on scenarios to where, just think about a survivor who has just experienced a horrific trauma, you know, known as sexual assault, right? And again, without even kind of thinking deeper of what that could look like, coming to you at 2 a.m., right, for an exam or to go through, you know, to be law enforcement, to ask you questions or whatever that is, right? And you haven't eaten, right? That survivor hasn't eaten since lunch, right? Maybe it's because of the incident. Maybe it's because they just don't have food, right? And you know, maybe in dirty clothes, maybe you know, whatever. And then you're saying, okay, like, these are your rights. This is, you know, what time did this happen? Like, have you been abused before? Like, and just think about how each of us in our best moments would respond to that, right? And in our best moments, we probably would be uncomfortable. We probably would be more upset. We probably would not necessarily get the response of healing. And so what you're talking about is definitely, we're already starting off on the wrong foot, right? And so when we think about this question, like, what else can we do better? Like, what you are talking about is exactly where we need to start thinking, right? Like, how do we just start off on the right foot? And, you know, a lot of that comes even before you walk into the door with a survivor, because it means you have to have that cultural humility. It means you have to have that awareness. It means you have to have the practical skills, right? But also you have to stand with strong policies that say it's okay to, you know, not do the paperwork first, right? And, you know, not that the paperwork is not important. I don't want to say that either, because I know that that's tied to really critical funding and things like that. But how else can we, you know, move this, and so that it's not, you know, getting us off on the wrong foot? When I work with home visitors, this is an area that we always talk about as well, because just as, you know, all programs, they are required a lot of times for their program to, you know, let's do a screening, let's, you know, accept you into the program, and then now we can talk about things, right? And what we talk about is, like, how do you either break up those pieces, or how do you even do it in a more conversational way, right? Because some of those questions, I think a lot of the intimidation and the awkwardness even comes from just even having like a form, like, here we go, let me check these off. And sometimes there's ways that we can gather that information without reading the question, you know, as it's written, or without, you know, formally going through each of them, right, and re-traumatizing them. And so a lot of those things are conversations that internally we can have, right? And also we can each have our own self-reflection on, you know, in terms of, okay, what could this look like? Like, what could this look like, right? And what other possibilities are that can we put in place to where we are following, you know, our required areas, you know, in terms of paperwork, in terms of data entry, in terms of, you know, these things, but also doing it in a survivor in a survivor-centered way, in a culturally responsive way, right? So I love that you're thinking about that. And I hope that that is, again, something that all of us are thinking of when we're doing this. So thank you so much for your feedback and comment on that. Are there any other questions or responses or information anyone wants to share?
I don't have anything in chat or questions, so.
Okay, so go ahead and go to the next slide.
Okay.
Okay, so this one, I'm not going to read through all of them, but I did want to just kind of uplift that, again, this is just a brief, webinar, and there's a lot of information, and there's, a lot of conversation and content that, is, out there. And so these are just some resources. So when Joy sends you out the PDF of the PowerPoint, this will be included. And these are just some of the resources that are, really helpful. I will also be sending some files with some documents, for tools that she can pass along as well. And then I also, in this PowerPoint at the very end, there's a link to the YouTube links that, of the videos that I showed, because as I mentioned, I think that, part of the intent of today is to provide some tangible tools that can help start conversations either in your organization or your program or even in your communities, right? And so, and honestly, when I've done cultural groups on, I've done some groups on sexual assault survivors and human trafficking survivors, and I honestly, I will at some point when they're ready, I will share survivor stories using some of these videos and use it as a way to build connection and have them open up and talk a little bit more. So, again, there's some boundaries with that, but at the same time, these can be used as tools in many different ways. And I also wanted to I have a brief little video or, music video kind of to kind of end, but before that, I wanted to also let you know that I know that questions, sometimes we think of them later, and it's okay to reach out to me, if you have a question or need more information on something. So I put my email in the chat right now. And I hope that, sorry, I just realized I don't know if I put it to everybody, but I will do that again while the music video is playing. But I wanted to kind of just open that, invitation up that you can feel free to email me if you would like to. And I'm going to end today with this music video. So if you want to go to the next slide, Joy, and go ahead and play that. And just again, to end with that resiliency piece.
One hero, one try, one try. What I know, we are one. What I know, we are one. It all starts with the people. One people, we stand all together. One voice, saying yes, we can. Reach one till we pull ourselves up, cause we all one family. From the rest of the block to the prairie to the rock, we connect that love. Cause the people with power feel the power of the people when we stand there. Yourself off the realness, we be indigenous, you heard of us. Accept that the murderers spreading the love with the water and understand it. Yes, they kinda know what the purpose is. We vibe, the climate is changing, signs of the times. It's time to start praying. Pray for the world and community. Prayers are more powerful when we're in unity. What I know, we are one. What I know, we are one. Woke up today, Hungry for a change, new path to take. Can't stay the same. It's been too long. Putting out who's right or wrong. Can you hear me out? All we need is a little bit of love. Take time to heal, and it starts with us. Hand in hand, I put my trust in one world. Reunite, it's a must. Hold on to hope we can overload. We can break the code with a single note. Sing out for the world to hear that our time is now. No more for tears. I looked into my son's eyes. A new day in a new life. Lift the violin, dwell so peaceful. Come together, one world, one. What I know, what I know. We are one. What I know, what I know. We are one. It's who you are, it's who I am. We all bleed the same blood, yeah. We all bleed the same blood. We got beautiful differences. Let me give you a peek over 500 tribes. We're all unique. And if we could not compete to eat, nothing could beat us. Jealousy is more dangerous than diabetes. See this unity? Imagine what it looked like. You would think you would do whatever it took, right? I would do anything for this good life. We could do anything if we unite.
Young David, you are my savior. Say a prayer for our inspiration. From the block to your reservation. Any color, all my relations. From the basement worldwide invasion. Every day we're pain in our faces. Fighting back to learning our language. Dancing our dance, saying our
What I know, what I know. We are one. What I know, what I know. We are one. We only have one word. We only have one word. We only have one word. Yeah. All we got is one voice, one choice, one life, one love, one birth, one life. Yeah. One people, we stand all together, one voice saying yes. Reach one till we pull ourselves up, cause we all one band. From the rest of the block, the rock, connect that line. Cause the people with power, the people who stand as what I know, what I know. We are one. What I know, what I know. We are one. What I know.
Like I said, I like showing and ending kind of on something that really, really is, empowering and kind of shows, our community resilience. And so that particular, video is also, I feel like, a continuation of our orality and our traditions, just in a contemporary way, right? Showing that we are constantly thriving and evolving, and that's really important as well. And so I want to thank you all today for being here in this space. Thank you so much, Joy and Strong Hearted Native Women's Coalition, for always putting on these amazing spaces for really, really important conversations. So I hope you all have a wonderful Friday and weekend. Joy, I don't know if there's anything else you need to say or any other questions. I'll hang out for just a moment too.
Okay, yeah, I was just gonna see if anybody else had a question, a comment, anything to add. If not, oh, Maria raised her hand. All right, Maria, here you go. Your mic is live. Well, you should be able to unmute yourself now because I sent you a request.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am.
I just want to say thank you. That is one of the best presentations I've seen in a very long time. You have touched in so many high points. unbelievable. For myself, for being a human traffic survivor and a GV survivor, you had hit some really strong points there, and it's amazing, amazing. So I just want to thank you for that.
Well, thank you, Maria, and thank you for being here, right? I mean, I think that, you know, this is a really heavy conversation and it's sometimes difficult, and at the same time, it's much needed in our communities. And, you know, I thank you for being here. And, you know, it is hard, right? It is hard to talk about these things, and it's hard to talk about them in an hour and a half or 2 hours, right? Because we're forced to kind of be selective even in terms of, okay, what do we talk about? And sometimes in my presentations, it's been like, okay, like this is the very technical and skill piece of developing a sexual assault response team, or like this is, you know, let's work directly on, you know, what this looks like. And it's hard because it's so massive. So I hope that I was able to kind of bring in a little bit for you all to think about, right? Because these are things I think about still, and I'm not in any way an expert, right? Like I think that, but I try to bring my experience, and not only my personal experience, but my professional experience, you know, in a way to say, okay, I'm thinking about these things. And I know I've heard these in all of the tribal communities that I've worked with. Like there must be some things that we could be doing better, right? And so thank you for your you know, acknowledgement, and also thank you for being here in this space too.
Yeah, I just want to say one more thing. I think that with your presentation, and when you with your slide and your stories and stuff, that presentation is very powerful and it's not overwhelming. You know, when you're dealing in this type of area, sometimes some presentations are very too overwhelming, you know. So I just want to congratulate you on that.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful feedback too.
So we have another question from Sarah. You're good to go, Sarah. Oh, where'd she go?
I'm here.
Okay,
sorry. I didn't have a question. I just wanted to thank you for sharing your presentation with us. And the music video was amazing. So thank you.
Oh, good. Yes. And the links are in the slides. So, I mean, again, any time that we can kind of share the wonderful work that our community members are doing, and also that resiliency piece, you know, so share it along.
Yeah, that was great. Anybody else? Oh, I think we're good. Cibonay, thank you so much. Thank you for making the time for us. I know that your schedule in particular is been flipped upside down, so we appreciate your time and your energy and your information always.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And thank you for always thinking of me. And I will send you some documents right now too, so that if you want to send them out, or if you just want to have them posted for anyone who joined, or kind of some resources, I'll do that right now. And then you can share my email too. I couldn't put it in, it said it didn't want to let me put it for everybody, but you can pass along my email.
Yeah, I will. I'll send it out to everyone with the information you send me, because you're going to send it a PDF, correct?
Yeah, I sent you the PDF already before this morning, and then I'll send you another email right now with some other tools and kind of documents just for resources.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of the day and weekend, and we'll see you back here next Tuesday. We have Mike Duncan presenting. So, all right. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.